Hello and welcome to the African World. I'm Kwame Clement reporting. Our special guest on the program today is Excellency Ebrahim Rasool, Ambassador of the Republic of South Africa to the United States. Ambassador Rasool has previously served as a Member of Parliament of South Africa. He also served as Special Advisor to the President of that country. He was also Premier, or as we will call it here, Governor of the Western Cape Province, and he led key ministries in the South African government, including the Ministry of Health, Welfare, Finance, and Economic Development. He was a long-standing member of the struggle to end apartheid from high school, serving first as a member of the UDF, the United Democratic Front, then as a member of the African National Congress, the ANC. It's a pleasure to have you on the program, Ambassador Rasool.
No, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to meet you at last.
Oh, well, thank you so much.
Yeah.
16, 17 years ago, the world saw that wonderful tableau of seas of voters. For the first time, many of them exercising their right to vote and transitioning South Africa from apartheid to majority rule. What has happened since then? What are the key progress you can point to as a South African?
I think that the key achievements of South Africa, and we don't emphasize it sufficiently, is that our people are free, they live with dignity, and they live with absolute equality before the law. And you've got to understand that in order to understand that much has been achieved in the nation of South Africa. In addition to that, the dignity has been underpinned by access to services that people have never had before, like running water, electricity. It's been underpinned by simple things such as waste removal. It's been underpinned also by just the way in which people now have access to healthcare. Every child is in school, and the way in which we are starting to see a growing economy that is reaping economic results for the people of South Africa.
We'll talk about the economy, the progress, and the challenges that remain. But let's go back a little bit more. Oftentimes, it's easy to point to the man Mandela as the cause for this. But what about the broader South African society that explains this rather remarkable, peaceful transition of power?
I think someone like Nelson Mandela would be the first to not use the word miracle to describe what has happened in South Africa. Neither would he want to attribute it all to himself. I think that sometimes the world, when the world is at its most selfish and self-centered, when the world adopts values which is alien to values of Ubuntu, of unity and interdependence, when the world acts counter-instinctively, it attributes either to the divine or to a single person what it doesn't understand. But truly that transition in South Africa was an effort of thousands upon thousands of people on the streets, in jails, in exile, being shot down at Sharpeville and many other places, and making enormous sacrifices to bring about that moment of glory that came when Nelson Mandela became president of the country. And everything in our entire history taught us and prepared us for that moment. We always knew that we hated the system of apartheid without ever hating white people. We always knew that our enemy was a system and not a people. And we always knew that if the conditions were ever right to make a strategic compromise in order to minimize bloodshed, damage to the economy, and the destruction of our social fabric further, that we should grasp that with both hands, as long as our principles of freedom, dignity, equality, and non-racialism could be achieved. And that, I think, is what 1994 is a remarkable tribute to.
And oftentimes when people speak about South Africa and look at the divide, there's a tendency to look at it simplistic, black, white. But that's a very diverse society in terms of race, culture, religion. Speak to that a little bit.
I think that South Africans themselves underestimate the magnitude of what we have done, and therefore we are overly modest in providing wisdom, lessons, and advice to a world that is racked by the very challenge of how to manage diversity. We have in South Africa a small Muslim minority that tended at critical moments towards extremism and fundamentalism and terrorism. But we managed that without a single incident of torture, without a state of emergency, and we brought to rest the soul of such a community which today is in the eye of the storm globally, and especially poignant with the killing of Osama bin Laden. That's a lesson that South Africa must share with the world. In much the same way, reconciling people who have fought each other for 50 years is a singular achievement, and forging out of those divisions the kind of reconciliation and national unity. It's not perfect. No one in South Africa would claim perfect non-racialism. But you know we are debating all of those issues all the time. Historic debates about what constitutes hate speech, about whether songs that you sang against the apartheid system is still relevant today. Now other people would see that as a blot on our national fabric. We would say that is the proof that we are alive, we take nothing for granted, and more importantly, that we are systematically working our way through debating, through robust engagement with each other towards a far more perfect society.
Let's pivot to the present and look at what you've done in terms of economic progress since the transition from white minority rule. South Africa has a stock market that ranks amongst the top 20 in the world. In terms of GDP, she's about the 25th ranked in the world. In many ways, we're talking about a first world economy, aren't we?
I think that we have all the features of that first world economy, but we will be the first to insist that we are still an emerging economy. We are not of the size and magnitude of our fellow BRICS members, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. But I think that we represent for Africa its most diversified economy, its most industrialized economy, its most robust economy. And so I think that South Africa is an important success story on the African continent, even though we don't have the kind of GDP that Mozambique, Angola, and other countries, particularly the oil-producing countries, are able to show.
You mean per capita GDP?
Per capita GDP. And so, in a real sense, I think that we have some of the key features of a first world economy, but we still have the horrible features of a second economy that's largely black, largely rural, largely carried by women. And that, I think, disabuses us of any illusions that we have arrived. The gap between our first world and our second world is far too great in South Africa for us ever to be complacent. And yet I think that it's a task that we are very conscious of.
Yeah, you speak eloquently about this duality. First world economy on the one hand, and the rest, largely rural and poverty-stricken. How you bridge that gap?
The crux of it is in the way in which we are able to create decent work. The most important inclusion into the benefits of the first world economy is to find a skill that can enable you to find a job within that economy. And so, for example, we wouldn't be satisfied any longer simply with mining and bringing gold from below the earth to the surface and selling that on the world. The same with diamonds, the same with platinum, uranium, etc., etc. We are really pushing that our young people are skilled in order to turn gold and diamonds into jewelry through design. That we are absolutely certain that the grapes and the other vegetables and fruits that we grow shouldn't simply be put onto the nearest ship and sent off to the world. We should be adding value to it. And that, I think, is where a lot of our energy and efforts are being placed. But for others who are now over 60, for others who have one or other disability, they are excluded from that first world economy. And so South Africa is probably one of the most extensive social security systems in which people over the age of 60 have access to pensions. People with a disability or other have access to a grant. Children who grow up and must have their brains focused without any impediment, they have access to child grants. And so The bridge between that is a bridge of skills and education on the one hand, but it's a bridge of social security and free healthcare and free education on the other hand. And hopefully that bridge will touch each other at some point and be a point of harmony between our disparate worlds in the country.
I'd like you to speak to the issue of how do we attract foreign investors to Africa in general, but South Africa in particular. What do we tell the typical American investor, for example, why he should come to South Africa? What are the opportunities?
Kwame, I could not have become ambassador of South Africa to the United States at a more opportune time than now. I want to say to you that the images back to the USA coming from the first African World Cup, the Soccer World Cup, has created such enormous warmth towards Africa and to South Africa. The scales are beginning to fall from people's eyes. They did not expect to find in Africa 24/7 banking connectivity. They found it when they came for the World Cup. They did not expect 24/7 fast speed broadband connectivity. They found it when they came for the World Cup. They did not expect a level of hospitality infrastructure where the hotels that they lived in are sometimes better than the ones you can find in New York. They found it in South Africa. They did not expect a transport connectivity where you could be anywhere from one airport to the next within 2 hours without either a pat down or a scan that shows your nakedness. So those are the things that they found in South Africa, and it has begun to change the mindset. The second thing is, Africa has many desperate needs, but Africa no longer needs to simply beg for what it wants. Empirical evidence is emerging at the hand of crucial works like the McKinsey report, like Emerging Africa, the book by Stephen Radlett. The latest is the JP Morgan report on the African economy as a whole. And that tells not an emotional story about Africa, it tells a story in statistics and numbers about the fact that in Africa, you've got the highest rates of return on investment anywhere in the world. The discrepancy between Africa's return on investment is 8%. The global average is 3%. You've got to come to Africa to make money. The second thing is that Africa is outstripping even the OECD countries with an average growth rate of 5%, when the US is down to 2.5% growth rate in GDP. That Africa has 60% of the world's arable land, so that instead of receiving food aid from the world in future, Africa will be the guarantor of food security for the world because we have uncontaminated land. We've got to access that without destroying our rainforests and our tropical forests and the lungs that we provide also for the world. And so the story to the American audience is, at the one hand, a warm emotional story coming out of the World Cup. On the other hand, it's a hard empirical story that speaks for itself. And the proposition we are making to the US investors is very simply, we need you, but you also need us. If you want to pull the American economy out of recession, you've got to export. The largest and fastest growing middle class in the world is in Africa. 300 million people in Africa are moving to the cities. They are increasingly educated, they are earning salaries, and they want to buy goods. You've got to send that to Africa. And our story is really one in which we are presenting them for the first time with a win-win situation rather than a call to save us. And that's the crucial difference in the call for investments.
Ambassador Ebrahim Rasool, Ambassador of South Africa to the United States, our special guest on the African World today. I'm Kwame Clement. We'll be back in just a moment. Stay tuned, everybody. Hello and welcome back to the African World. Kwame Clement reporting. Our special guest on the program once again is Excellency Ebrahim Rasool, Ambassador of the Republic of South Africa to the United States. Ambassador Rasool, when we left off, you were making the case quite eloquently, backed by empirical evidence, as to why Africa should be an investment destination. And you mentioned a couple of reports, like the McKinsey reports, that back up what you were saying. Maybe we should highlight some of the data in that report. It speaks, for example, that Africa has a combined GDP of $1.6 trillion. In 2008, consumer spending in 2010 was over $800 million. And the fact that cell phone subscribers have increased from about 200 million in 2000 to 500 million in 2010. Pretty impressive numbers that again make the case for looking to Africa as a business destination.
I think it's more than a business destination. It's the source of salvation for the world economy. I think that what we need to do in Africa is to understand what stands between Africa and its payday. And the critical constraint in Africa is its infrastructure. We don't have sufficient energy to power that massive potential. We don't have sufficient road and rail networks and harbor and airport infrastructure to turn our potential into actual and to make this work for Africa. And that is why I think that the first critical thing we're going to have to get right is an infrastructure drive to secure enough energy. And we've just had wonderful news from both the World Bank and the Export-Import Bank of the United States that is going to ensure that Eskom in South Africa is able to build the kind of power stations that it requires to add to the energy sources. The second thing that I think is going to be absolutely critical is the rail rollout in South Africa and in the African continent. General Electric is coming to the party in terms of 100 locomotives to get things going. And so we can point out how all over Africa some of these investments in overcoming the critical constraints are coming into place. And then secondly, the other constraint we've got to overcome is the skills one. And we are seeing the beginning of a return of skills that have left Africa back there. People are beginning, the African diaspora, they're beginning to see there is money to be made back home as well, and there's a contribution to be made. And we are beginning to see that skills, where they've picked up the wisdom, they've picked up the technology, they've picked up the skills in the USA, in Europe and so forth, and they're saying, let's plow it back. If we can get a perfect storm between a return of skills and an inflow of investments into the infrastructure, that McKinsey points to will become a realizable asset for Africa.
And the key to all of this, of course, you would agree, Mr. Ambassador, is political stability. The continent, no doubt, has made tremendous strides in this regard. Peaceful elections in Ghana, elections coming up in Liberia, recently held in Nigeria. But the perception, backed somehow by the hard realities on the ground, is that there tend to be a stifling of political dissent that often leads to instability and the like on the continent. What's the message we get back to our African leaders about the need to put in place reforms and structures that would allow for a liberalization of the political process?
Kwame, if you had asked me this question 3-4 years ago, I would have had to have 3 hands to show you how many conflicts there were in Africa. Asking me that question in 2011, I need 1 hand to show you how many problems we have in Africa. And what that basically means is that Africa is solving its problems. We had a situation in Côte d'Ivoire. If you were to look in time, it was slightly more than how long it took to sort out the Bush-Gore election. And that puts it into perspective. I mean, for a long time, the German elections was about putting together an unwieldy grand coalition where one foot is on the accelerator, the other foot is on the brake. And so I think that Africa is beginning to have normal problems rather than abnormal problems from before. I think that African leaders are beginning to understand what the democracy dividend is about. That what you put in for democracy, establishing the rule of law and giving people freedom and giving people access to social networks and all of those kind of things, you are reaping back in terms of investment, trade, exports, and all of those kind of things. So I don't want to paint an unduly optimistic picture. We still have a far way to go. But the situation is infinitely better. And Africa is showing a capacity to solve its problems, sometimes in very African ways. But the objectives are coming out in much the same positive way. But I think we would be the first to say that the precondition for all of this growth is political stability. And the fact that I could say that the constraints are infrastructure and skills, before I said violence and war, and the lack of democracy, I think shows a completely different mindset change. And we are very confident that Zimbabwe will resolve itself over the next few months. Cote d'Ivoire will become from the post-election crisis and will... But look at Ghana. A differential between the winning and the losing candidate of probably about 1%. The losing candidate, despite having been incumbent, retired. Where else do you get this kind of thing without disputing the result? Now, why don't we look at that as the example of the new Africa, rather than hold on to the old usual suspects? And I think that everyone is beginning to understand that Africa is not just a continent of growth, but a continent of growing democracy.
Mm-hmm. Another issue I'd like you to speak to briefly is the need for integrating the economies. Now, there may be some difficulties given the different level of economic development, say South Africa compared with Liberia, but no doubt there's the view, which I think has some merit to it, that if Africa is to accelerate the growth process and really spread the benefit of economic growth, there's need for more fuller economic integration across the continent. What's your view on this? And what role you see South Africa in particular playing this, given the fact that it accounts for, 5% of the continent's population, but about 50% of its economic output?
South Africa has understood that we can't be an island. The old African saying, if you run alone, you run fast. If you run together, you run far, is particularly applicable to the way in which South Africa sees its Africa policy, both economically and politically. And so, using that wisdom as our precept, we have started the first step of integrating ourselves into SADC. SADC today is a strong integrated market where we don't do what Botswana can do better or what Mozambique can do better. When we speak about energy supplies, we speak right up to the Congo about both exporting energy to the Congo, and when the Congo River comes online, them exporting to all of us. We're beginning to plan like that.
Mm-hmm. Taking advantage of comparative advantage.
Absolutely. And where the negotiations are now is that Southern Africa, through SADC, the East African community and the Central African community are negotiating an intra-regional free trade agreement in order to make sure that the world can do business with one big sub-Saharan free trade zone, and more importantly, that our market is big enough to absorb. South Africa, with its middle class of about 10 million people, it's not going to satisfy the bulk that the US needs to supply to it. But add that into the 400 million middle class across Africa, you're talking about something completely different. And if you want to enter that market, you need a free trade zone where the conditions are the same, the business climate is the same, the pricing structure is the same throughout sub-Saharan Africa. And that, I think, is the most exciting development of regional integration. It's not just Southern Africa integrating, it is Southern Africa integrating with East, East integrating with Central, Central integrating with West, and eventually all of us integrating with North. And so the old favorites of stability are proving to be the engines of change in the north, whereas sub-Saharan Africa suddenly is beginning to be a beacon of stability. How the world has changed.
Sometimes the more they change, the more they stay. No, I mean that's a pretty good point. I think in the South we went through our problems in the 80s and 70s and managed to kind of work things out, whereas the North just kind of late at the game going through what we've gone through. But I think at the end of the day, you will agree though that the changes we're seeing in the North, or the Arab awakening, as they call it, are for the better.
Absolutely. I don't think we should ever have any doubt that it is for the better. You could not close off one section of the world simply because a superpower sees that as key to securing the future of one country or securing the energy supply to the Western world as we know it, and therefore they don't qualify for democracy, don't qualify for freedom, don't qualify for gender equality, etc., etc. I think that those anomalies are uncomfortable in the age that we're in today. And for Africa's development, you couldn't have a North that looks entirely to the rest of the Middle East for their identity, for their flow of goods. They need to understand, they need to integrate southwards, not northwards. And I want to really say that this is the exciting development. And the fact that you mentioned the 80s as that moment of change, because before, we were the playground for the Cold War. We were the guinea pigs for when the Soviet Union wanted to do something and they wanted to have a sphere of influence, and the United States wanted to do something and have a sphere of influence. They didn't care about whether Africans were trampled underground when the two elephants of the world fought each other. I think that when that Berlin Wall collapsed, Africa could breathe a sigh of relief and say, our time has come. And that, I think, is why we must make sure that the 21st century is the African century. Our time has come.
His Excellency Ebrahim Rasool, Ambassador of South Africa to the United States, been our guest on the program today. We covered the waterfront, South Africa's transition from minority rule to majority rule, the economic progress the country has made, the challenges that still exist, given the enormous problem the government inherited since the change to majority rule. Then we look at the sea change in Africa's economic fortunes, as well as political liberalization on the continent. It's been a pleasure to have you on the program, Mr. Ambassador. We look forward to having you again sometime soon.
No, thanks very much, and it's wonderful having met you and speaking to you in a very relaxed atmosphere. Thanks very much.
We'd love to have you back soon.
Thanks very much.
I'm Kwame Clement for the African World. Thanks for viewing. We'll see you next week on another edition of the program. So long, everybody.